Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the explosion at the Five Poppies Resort unleashed more than just fire and debris. It detonated a chain reaction that sent tremors throughout the social and political fabric of Port Charles. What began as a catastrophic incident quickly unraveled into a multi-layered saga of personal vendettas, strategic deception, and emotional manipulation. In the wake of the chaos, the sterile halls of General Hospital became a battleground not only for recovery but for control, vengeance, and revelation. Drew's awakening in a hospital bed wasn't just a moment of medical triumph, it was the ignition point for an entirely new storm. One that would place Michael Corinthos at the center of a criminal investigation and potentially shatter every family tie he held dear. Without hesitation, Drew pointed the finger directly at Michael, accusing him of being the one who shot him. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a calculated move by a man who believed he had just survived an attempt on his life by someone he once considered family. With those few words, Drew did more than set an investigation in motion. He altered the destiny of everyone involved. From Willow to Wiley to Amelia. Beneath the layers of medical equipment and the routine post-op assessments, Drew's mind was spinning with intentions far beyond recovery. He questioned the presence of Portia as his physician, interpreting her insistence on remaining as a tactical hold over him, perhaps even a threat to the sensitive information he had hidden. That information tucked away in a safe alongside Willow's engagement ring wasn't just sentimental. It was ammunition, documents implicating Portia in ethically murky behavior, perhaps even criminal in nature. This safe, long thought to contain remnants of a failed relationship, suddenly became a vault of leverage. Drew, ever the strategist, had weaponized his vulnerability, transforming his hospital room into a war room. When Dante arrived to probe the incident, Drew didn't merely recount the shooting. He offered a narrative designed to isolate Michael, painting him not just as a suspect but as a man with motive, access, and emotional volatility. In that single accusation, Drew transformed a familial rift into a legal confrontation, one that could potentially result in Michael's incarceration and, more significantly, Drew's ascension in Willow's emotional hierarchy. The allegations against Michael didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were shaped and sharpened by Drew's vision of a future where Willow, free from her complicated past, would choose his stability. With Michael discredited and detained, Drew believed Willow would have no choice but to seek refuge in him, especially with Amelia and Wiley potentially pulled into the gravitational force of a custody battle. From Drew's perspective, it was poetic, removing a rival while securing a family, all under the guise of truth and justice. But Michael was no novice. The moment he heard of Drew's accusation, he activated his own counteroffensive, racing against time to find Jacinda, one woman who could provide him with an airtight alibi. Her testimony had the power to dismantle Drew's narrative and restore the balance of power. Michael didn't just want to clear his name. He wanted to expose Drew for the manipulative tactician he had become. And to do that, he needed Jacinda to remember, to testify, and to survive the tightening noose of legal and emotional warfare. Jacinda, however, wasn't a simple pawn. Her history with Drew was tangled in cash transactions, coercion, and fear. Having once taken money to leave Port Charles and stay silent, she now found herself back in the city, financially desperate and morally conflicted. Portia attempted to neutralize her again, warning that reopening past drug-related allegations would not only destroy Drew but potentially implicate herself and Nina as well. The doctor's pleas were clear: if Jacinda didn't toe the line, she'd be dragged down with them. But desperation is a wild card. Jacinda, tethered between financial ruin and a sliver of redemption, made her decision when Michael found her at Port Charles Grill. It wasn't just Michael's plea that swayed her, it was the realization that Drew had already written her off, treating her as a variable to be controlled, not a person to be respected. She chose to stand with the man who asked for truth, not silence. Dandy's arrival during Michael's meeting with Jacinda was more than a procedural interruption. It was the physical embodiment of the law catching up to a lie. Drew's accusation had opened a formal case, and now every detail needed scrutiny. Michael faced not just suspicion but the full weight of a potential indictment. But unlike Drew's emotionally charged, strategically veiled accusation, Michael came armed with receipts, literal and figurative. Dante, caught between two brothers, understood the stakes intimately. A false accusation meant obstruction. A truthful one meant betrayal. And if Jacinda's timeline aligned with Michael's version of events, Drew's carefully built house of cards would collapse. At the same time, Anna Devane oversaw the broader investigation, probing every connected incident with a sharp eye. Alexis's account, backed by Diane's legal prowess, outlined movements and meetings that helped paint a clearer picture of who was where and when during the night of the explosion and shooting. From her meetings with Curtis about Stella's legal case to her hours spent mediating between Ava and Christina, Alexis provided data points that corroborated several independent timelines. These weren't random anecdotes, they were keystones in a case that would rely heavily on the integrity of witness movements and the exactitude of timestamps. The more Anna gathered, the clearer it became that nothing about Drew's accusation was cut and dry. If anything, it stank of desperation and orchestration. Elsewhere, the fallout extended to Charlotte, Lulu, and Brennan, whose interwoven concerns about safety, legacy, and manipulation played out in the background but mirrored the broader chaos. Brennan, ever the operative, tried to leverage Charlotte's lineage to forge a deal with Valentine through WSB, while Lulu tried to shield her daughter from becoming a bargaining chip. The simmering tension between familial duty and strategic exploitation echoed the very themes unraveling between Drew, Michael, and Willow. How far would one go to protect, or to possess, those they claimed to love? Meanwhile, in the literal rubble of 5 Poppies, Jason, Britt, Vaughn, and Jocelyn clawed their way to safety. The explosion had been real, but so too was the betrayal that led to it. Jason, narrowly escaping with Britt, was forced once again to become the protector. Vaughn's unexpected return with a firearm turned a deadly standoff into a chaotic escape, but the physical injuries were just surface level. Britt, ever grateful yet emotionally walled off, confronted Jason not with tears but with barbed humor, her acknowledgement of his sacrifice undercut by her refusal to let him back in. The chemistry between them was palpable but haunted, as if the fire they ran from was now burning beneath their feet emotionally. Their escape, though successful, was a temporary reprieve from a much deeper blaze awaiting them back in Port Charles. Back at the hospital, the legal team supporting Drew realized the tide was turning. The more Jacinda spoke, the more she unveiled not just her own timeline but Drew's manipulations attempt to pay her off, his veiled threats, his willingness to suppress truth to shape perception. Dante's notes thickened with contradiction. Anna's office filled with files and requests for warrants. The contents of Drew's safe now represented a ticking time bomb of its own that could either vindicate or indict him, depending on what exactly those documents contained and how much they revealed about his dealings with Portia and others. If the documents corroborated any part of Jacinda's revised statement, Drew's credibility would be shattered. Worse still, if he had tampered with evidence or obstructed justice in an attempt to frame Michael, then even Willow's sympathy couldn't shield him from prosecution. Willow, caught in the crossfire, became the unwitting fulcrum upon which the entire narrative balanced. Her love for Michael, though complicated, had once been the bedrock of her emotional stability. Drew's presence during Michael's absence had offered her comfort, clarity, and consistency, but at what cost? Now, faced with the possibility that Drew had manipulated an investigation to eliminate a rival, Willow began to question everything. The ring, the safe, the hospital visit, each moment was reevaluated in the harsh light of truth. Would she become a participant in Drew's delusion, or reclaim agency over her own heart and future? The wave that began at 5 Poppies did not stop at the water's edge. It surged inland, toppling facades, exposing fault lines, and redrawing alliances. As PCPD inched closer to requesting access to Drew's safe and Jacinda's full testimony neared public disclosure, the countdown wasn't just to the conclusion of a case, it was to the collapse of a narrative Drew had spent months building. And somewhere, in the echo of that impending reckoning, Michael waited not as a victim, but as a survivor preparing to reclaim not just his name, but his family. Outside the sterile walls of General Hospital, where the scent of antiseptic lingered heavier than the echoes of gunfire, Michael Corinthos stood locked in a race against time. Each second that passed chipped away at his carefully cultivated public image, and more dangerously, threatened to sever the already fragile thread connecting him to his children and to the truth. Drew's accusation had landed with lethal precision, implicating Michael in an attempted murder, and though Michael understood the emotional undertones driving Drew's vendetta, the law would not pose to weigh sentiment. The only shield he had was the truth, and for that, he needed Jacinda. Her name wasn't just a flicker from memory, it was a lifeline. She alone held the key to a timeline that could absolve him. Yet Jacinda, like the truth itself, was elusive, tangled in a web of secrets and survival instincts. Curtis Ashford, ever the tactician, served as Michael's bridge, offering insights from his past investigations. It was Curtis who revealed the obscure modeling agents and nothing more than a facade for a high-end escort operation that Jacinda once worked with. From there, Michael began assembling his defense not from law books but from fragments of a night riddled with shadows. The deeper Michael dug, the more fragmented the narrative became. Jacinda had made a career of vanishing acts, and retracing her movements was like following footprints in sand. Hotel check-ins under pseudonyms, burner phone calls, unexplained cash withdrawals. It was a mosaic of desperation and fear. But Michael was relentless. He mapped the scattered pieces of her presence back to Port Charles, eventually tracing her steps to the place that would become the epicenter of this storm, Port Charles Grill. When he finally arrived, his nerves coiled tightly beneath his skin. The glances he exchanged with passersby, the waitstaff, the noise of clinking glass, all of it blurred as his focus narrowed to one goal: find Jacinda before the state found him guilty. With every tick of the clock, the window for redemption narrowed. He knew that his silence could be weaponized as guilt, and unless he could build a meticulous, unimpeachable timeline that placed him away from the scene, with witnesses, receipts, and confirmation, risked losing everything. While Michael braced himself for confrontation, Jacinda stood at the edge of her own precipice. Her return to Port Charles was not one of bravery, but necessity. Once upon a time, she had been paid to disappear, bought off by Drew with the understanding that her silence was part of a larger protection plan. That deal was supposed to grant her financial security and peace of mind. But money dwindles fast when managed poorly, and what was once a clean break morphed into a desperate circle back to the same town that had nearly swallowed her whole. Her visit to Portia's office wasn't just a call for help, it was a plea wrapped in a warning. Portia, stone-faced and unrelenting, made it clear that there would be no financial rescue this time. Instead, she reminded Jacinda of the legal quicksand that surrounded them both. The whispers of a drug scheme involving not just Drew but Nina and herself still lingered, threatening to ensnare all three if stirred. Portia's demand was chilling in its simplicity. If interrogated, Jacinda was to claim Drew voluntarily transported the narcotics, thereby placing the weight of criminality solely on his shoulders. Any deviation from that script, Portia warned, would be suicidal. For Jacinda, it was a command to remain a puppet, but her strings were fraying. As Jacinda exited Portia's office, her phone rang, as if summoned by fate. On the other end was Michael, not with threats, not with bribes, but with a question: would she choose truth or convenience? She didn't answer right away. The crossroads she stood upon was not just legal, it was existential. To continue playing both sides meant permanent exile from her own conscience. But siding with Michael, the man who asked for her testimony not to manipulate but to liberate, offered something neither Drew nor Portia ever had: dignity. When she agreed to meet him, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was reclamation. Their meeting at Port Charles Grill was not cinematic, it was tense, subdued, almost reverent in its gravity. Michael explained his position, showed the timeline, pointed out the gaps Jacinda could fill. She listened, her eyes no longer darting with fear but anchored in resolve. Then came Dante, like the steady tick of a metronome, his entrance slicing through the room like a verdict. He didn't raise his voice or flash his badge. He didn't have to. His presence alone brought the rule of law into focus. The moment Dante stepped into the conversation, the casual air between Michael and Jacinda evaporated. There would be no more informal negotiations, no more whispered strategies. Everything from that point forward would be on the record: each word, each hesitation, each inconsistency. Dante's approach wasn't aggressive, but surgical. He understood the stakes better than anyone and knew that any story not rooted in verifiable fact would be discarded as noise. Meanwhile, back at General Hospital, Dante had already taken detailed notes of Drew's statement. The former Navy SEAL had given a blow-by-blow account of the shooting, the pressure in his back as the bullet tore through muscle, the moment he bent over to pour a drink, the faint click of the safe as he retrieved Willow's ringo laid out like testimony. But what Dante didn't say out loud, though it danced behind his eyes, was that the timeline was too clean. Real trauma was messy. Real memory was imperfect. And yet Drew's recollection was so precise, so performative, that it raised red flags. Moreover, his insistence on sealing off access to the contents of the safe under the guise of protecting personal documents only deepened Dandy's suspicion. Whatever was in that safe, it wasn't just a ring. It was leverage. Perhaps even the motive behind the entire fabrication. The deeper Dante looked, the more he found that every timeline had a shadow. Jacinda's story, once seen as unreliable, was starting to gain traction. Her locations matched hotel records. Her receipts corroborated Michael's. Her cell phone data triangulated with surveillance footage. Piece by piece, her presence during the time of the shooting began to form a clear alibi not just for herself, but for Michael. And the more she spoke, the more she undercut Drew's narrative. She recalled being approached, being paid, being warned. She remembered Drew's paranoia, his fear of being exposed, his obsession with keeping Willow close. To Jacinda, it became clear, Drew hadn't just made a mistake in accusing Michael. He had built an entire alternate reality around it. Dante, always the pragmatist, took all of this in with quiet gravity. He wasn't interested in emotional appeal, simply in evidence. And as the evidence began to tip in Michael's favor, it became increasingly clear that Drew might have orchestrated more than just a false accusation. He might have attempted to stage an entire crime scene to implicate Michael. That possibility changed the nature of the investigation entirely. It was no longer about who shot Drew. It was about who had the most to gain from Drew being seen as the victim of Michael's wrath. Back in the present, as Dante concluded his preliminary questioning, the weight of what was unfolding fell hard across the room. Michael, though not yet exonerated, now had something he didn't have before: momentum. Jacinda had tipped the scales. Her bravery in choosing the truth had set off a counterbalance to Drew's manipulation, one that was now rippling through the legal corridors of Port Charles. With each fact confirmed, each timestamp verified, and each contradiction in Drew's story unearthed, Dante prepared his next move, a request to access Drew's safe. If granted, and if that safe contained even a fragment of evidence proving intent to deceive or manipulate the legal process, Drew wouldn't just lose Willow, he'd lose his freedom. For now, the city waited. Michael had made his move. Jacinda had made her stand. Dante had begun to reshape the narrative. And somewhere, Drew likely felt the walls closing in. The metronome of justice had begun its steady, inevitable beat. And with each tick, the truth inched closer to the surface. In another corner of the city, Anna orchestrated her line of questioning like a detective mapping out a multi-tiered investigation. Alexis, accompanied by her legal counsel Diane, arrived prepared to provide a meticulous timeline of her whereabouts and actions, within the boundaries of her obligations. Seemingly minor details such as a restraining order, Curtis's visit to discuss Stella's case, or the 2 hours spent mediating between Ava and Christina for Avery's sake were all cataloged into a coherent sequence for verification. Diane concluded the session, believing her client had offered sufficient information, while Anna quietly noted areas requiring further scrutiny. The legal web continued to expand, no longer confined to the explosion and shooting, but now brushing up against personal dynamics and family trajectories once thought to be completely separate. Meanwhile, the familial undercurrents of Port Charles surged in an entirely different direction. Lulu, staring at Charlotte, no longer saw just a strong-willed young girl, but the living legacy of a complicated lineage, with Valentin's shadow never far behind. Brennan introduced the possibility of a meeting at Steinmauer, suggesting it could facilitate cooperation with the WSB. The implication was in settling that Charlotte's safety could become currency in a negotiation for broader national security interests. Lulu refused, yet her refusal exposed a deeper fissure, the tension between protecting her daughter and the allure of high-level diplomatic leverage. Outside, Charlotte voiced her resentment about Brennan and longed for the fleeting freedom she once had while on the run with Valentin. The seeds of rebellion were quietly sown amidst a day of spiraling chaos across the city. At the epicenter of disaster, Jason, Britt, Jocelyn, and Vaughn fought to escape the ruins of 5 Poppies. Each move was saturated with tension. Jason, with surgical precision and steady hands, dismantled the ankle monitor from Britt's leg while Pascal's countdown echoed in the background like a ticking death sentence. Vaughn's sudden arrival with a weapon helped forge an escape route through tightening corridors. And then the explosion struck, a violent crescendo that flung all four to the dust-choked floor. Miraculously, they survived with bruises and scrapes, their bodies intact, but their emotional armor cracked. In that chaotic moment, Britt felt Jason literally become her shield, absorbing the blast, then quickly retreating to a safe distance. Aware that emotional closeness was now a liability they could no longer afford. Amid the smoke and collapsing steel, a complex emotional thread began to weave itself, a thread sure to persist long after the last embers died out. Back at the hospital, the wounded flooded in from the blast site, while physical evidence made its way into the hands of investigators. Bullet casings, scorch marks, footprints, and explosive residue painted a grim picture and hinted at a larger network operating behind Pascal. Within this broader conspiracy, Drew's shooting felt both isolated and entangled, with branches growing from the same tangled root system. If someone stood to benefit from diverting attention away from the true scope of the crimes, they wouldn't stop with a single blow. As the lab teams worked tirelessly, the PCPD began comparing phone records, traffic cameras, and witness accounts, laying the groundwork for a cascade of search warrants soon to follow. With Jacinda now fully on board and ready to testify, Michael began reconstructing the night in question with meticulous precision. Payment receipts, rideshare data, GPS pings, and restaurant logs were assembled into a tightly constructed timeline that left little room for interpretation. Jacinda, once cast in a role written by others, now told her own story, and in doing so, placed Michael in a position that not even Drew could undermine. Every claim was corroborated by Dante, every timestamp verified by Anna. As the picture grew clearer, the cracks in Drew's narrative widened, threatening to collapse his carefully built version of events. But Drew wasn't a man to sit idly as the ground shifted beneath him. He stoked public sentiment through whispered rumors, feeding half-truths and character assassinations that painted Michael as volatile, manipulative, and dangerous. Behind closed doors, he leaned on the hospital staff, exerting subtle pressure to control what leaked from his room and when. His favorite shield remained the supposed confidentiality of the contents in his safe. That safe, he insisted, contained sensitive personal documents, and he brandished it as a legal smokescreen to delay any warrant that might expose him further. At the same time, he strategically invoked the well-being of Amelia and Wiley, reframing the situation as one where Michael's downfall would ensure the children's stability with him and Willow. To the public, it resembled a noble father's fight for his family. To investigators, it reeked of manipulation and self-interest. Caught in the middle of this storm was Willow, buffeted by opposing emotional forces. On one side, the lingering affection and gratitude toward Michael, a man she had once hoped to rebuild a future with. On the other, the raw, immediate image of Drew, bruised and nearly killed, positioning himself as her protector. Each new update from the hospital and the police precinct forced her to reevaluate where the truth lay, and what course of action would ensure safety, not just for herself, but for her children. Amelia and Wiley weren't just pawns in a custody battle. They were the moral compass behind every choice Willow now had to make. Each decision came weighted with consequence, and for that reason, she kept her heart guarded, measuring not just what she felt, but what she could live with. As the final threads of Jacinda's alibi testimony were woven into a tight net, Dante moved closer to requesting a warrant to open Drew's infamous safe. The questions circling the case had evolved. It was no longer just about who pulled the trigger, but who orchestrated the scene in such a way that the truth became nearly untraceable. If that safe held documents that could shift the gravitational pull of the case, either by proving premeditated deception or revealing a deeper conspiracy than any signs of tampering or obstruction, would escalate Drew's risk from suspect to orchestrator. Drew understood the threat and began scrambling to fortify his legal defenses. Meanwhile, Michael, unburdened by the initial weight of accusation, pivoted into a position of offensive, defending not just his name, but the peace and future of his children. The tug-of-war between these two men grew tighter with each passing hour, and in the lingering thunder of the Five Poppies explosion, poor Charles began to understand that the real war had only just begun. In the broader panorama, the explosion and the shooting no longer stood as two isolated incidents, but had merged into a single, escalating storyline. On one end, Jason and Britt paid for their survival with blood and adrenaline, staring down a future shadowed by danger and emotional entanglements yet to be named. On the other, Drew and Michael engaged in a battle for truth itself, phony that could redefine the meaning of loyalty, justice, and family. Jacinda, Portia, Alexis, Diane, Anna, Curtis, Lulu, Charlotte, and Brennan each held a vital key, each twist of the lock threatening to make the entire system groan under the weight of its secrets. They were all hurtling toward an intersection where law, morality, and ambition would collide. And now that Jacinda had chosen to stand beside Michael, the trajectory had shifted dramatically. Every arrow of doubt now turned back toward the source of the accusation. From here on out, testimony would no longer suffice. Only truth, backed by irrefutable evidence, would matter. And that's the game Port Charles was now preparing to play with eyes wide open.